We now move to the third presentation, which is given by Rachel Aldred. Rachel is a reader in transport at the University of Westminster, and she also teaches transport planning and management. And furthermore, she is a member of the editorial board of the journal Transport Reviews. And her talk will be about methods of evaluation and with respect to interventions. So thank you very much for being here. And Rachel, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm very happy to be here. So it follows on quite nicely from the first two talks, particularly Kieran's. I'm going to talk about evaluating interventions, which, as Kieran mentioned, the evidence is not always as strong as we'd like. And for us in the UK, this is not just an academic problem. We have a lot of political problems in terms of getting changes for walking and cycling, particularly where the car is restricted or perceived to be restricted. So actually, being able to see whether interventions work or not is really important for us, and hopefully for you too. So I'm going to talk about a couple of possible methods. These are not the only methods, but they're methods that I've found useful and hopefully might be interesting for you. So firstly, a method for evaluating large-scale interventions, big-ticket interventions. And secondly, a method for evaluating small-scale interventions. So, changes to the streetscape that are cheap, relatively small, and often don't get evaluated at all. Because we have, as Kieran mentioned, a causality problem. Sometimes we're lucky enough to see change, as in London, albeit from a low base. We see a change, but what caused the change? We often don't know. We've seen a change over time, but what caused it? Maybe it would have happened anyway. Cycling levels go up when it's hot. So you put in your infrastructure, but it got hot. So maybe it was the heat that made the numbers increase. What was it that was important? And would what we did work elsewhere? So doing better studies is part of the answer to some of these questions. The first method I want to talk about is called natural experiments. And I haven't got time to go into detail about this, but it comes from a development by John Snow. When we had in London, we had cholera in the mid-19th century, and medics, people didn't know what caused cholera. And John Snow developed the natural experiment method as a way of testing what the cause of cholera was. He took one group who got water from the Thames and who continued to get water from the Thames. And he compared them against a group who got water from the Thames to start off with and then got water from somewhere else. And the key thing is you've got a control group who stay in the same state, and you've got an intervention group who get a change. And John Snow was able to prove that the Thames was the cause of cholera, because the people who kept getting water from the Thames had a greater likelihood of getting cholera than the people who had the change and got water from somewhere else. So I'm not comparing cycling to cholera, but I am saying that this is a useful method for looking at the impact of interventions. If we can compare the people who got the bike track with a similar group of people who didn't get a change, then hopefully we can show that the bike track did or didn't make a difference. So I was thinking about natural experiments when I heard about London's Mini Holland schemes, which were announced in 2014. This was a really ambitious programme of interventions in 3 outer London boroughs. Outer London is suburban. It's traditionally quite car-dependent, quite car-dominated. It's not Hackney or central London. It's very different. And this was a proposal to spend £100 million in 3 outer London boroughs. So I was really excited about this, and I thought we should be doing some high-quality evaluation research on this. It's a perfect chance. And luckily, Transport for London funded me to do a study. It's been going for 3 years now, each year going back to people and finding out about their travel behaviour. Just to give you a flavour of some of these interventions, at the top, you can see an expensive infrastructure item, a new bike track built along a very hostile road. At the bottom, you see a shopping street that was very car-dominated turned into a street for people, for walking and cycling and spending time. So big changes, very controversial. So important to see what the effect had been. But what was almost even more exciting for me about studying this was that many of these interventions were area-wide. The attempts were made to take cars out of neighbourhoods, basically. So this was done first in a borough called Waltham Forest. This is part of Waltham Forest, and they closed many streets to through motor traffic so that there was a lot fewer cars going through that area. You could still drive to your house, but you couldn't drive from there to there. So these areas were seeing much lower levels of motor traffic. And I thought that was really good too for the method, because we could compare areas that had seen those changes with areas that hadn't, and see if there was a behaviour change associated. So the first paper from the study has been published in Transportation Research A. And so it uses a natural experiment approach. We recruited people across outer London. And so each year we go back and ask them how they travel, how they feel about travel. And the important thing is there are people in areas that are seeing Mini Holland interventions and in areas that are not. So we can compare. We can see if there is a change associated with living near Mini Holland schemes, interventions. And we've got around 1,700, 1,700 people participating every year. So we can compare the people in the control and intervention areas. It's an online study, so people participate online. This just gives you an idea of where they are. So that's Waltham Forest, that's Enfield, and that's Kingston. And those are the three Mini Holland boroughs, they call them. What we also did was identified high-dose areas. So the black areas are where things had actually changed on the ground. So first you've got a borough that is having interventions, but then you've got an area within that borough where you've actually made changes into the street. Just to say something about the survey questions. So at the core, we had a travel diary. We asked people about the trips they'd made in the past week, so we could compare changes from year to year. But we also asked them about attitudes to different modes, so we could see if attitudes changed, if people's feelings about the bike or the bus changed year to year. We asked them about their local environment, how they felt about the local streets, their neighbourhood. And we asked them about investment, their feelings about investment in different transport modes, and also demographic questions as well, so we could compare demographic groups. This just represents a local environment sub-questionnaire that we gave to them. So various questions that they had to agree, strongly agree, disagree with, or so on each year. So questions like, my local area is safe for an 8-year-old child to cycle, whether they agreed or disagreed. Most people disagreed. And a range of other questions related to their local neighbourhood. And the interesting thing about this was we found change after 1 year, which I was quite surprised. I didn't expect to see changes after only 1 year, because the evidence suggests that maybe it's 2 years before you see change happening. But these were big, ambitious interventions, and also they were area level. They were about reducing motor traffic in local neighbourhoods. And I think that's what, I think that made a difference, and that helped to get those results early, I think, because you had much lower levels of motor traffic in these neighbourhoods, many of these neighbourhoods that had been changed. So we saw an increase in participation in cycling. People were 24% more likely to have done any cycling in the past week. But we also saw increased time spent walking and cycling. So there were new cyclists, but there was also people spending more time walking and cycling. And interestingly, there was a bigger increase in walking than in cycling. So making those streets, making those local neighbourhoods more relaxing, more calm, less car dependent was really good for walking too, which maybe doesn't surprise you, but actually a lot of the debate around these schemes in the UK suggested that they would be bad for walking. So it was interesting that we found that they were good for walking. And we also saw a changed perception as well, that people living close to these interventions thought the local environment had got better. So it kind of fitted together. It made sense. It seemed to be a causal relationship. Those places where you put infrastructure in, particularly these high-dose areas, people were more likely to walk and cycle. People were more likely to cycle. They walked and cycled more, and they noticed that the environment had improved. Now, that's a relatively expensive method. If you have to go back and survey people year on year, it's not cheap. You have to recruit people, you have to survey them, every year, you have to retain your sample. But very often, interventions are small. They're not like the Mini Holland programme. Maybe you've put a planter in a street. You've made some small-scale changes. So the second method I'm going to talk about briefly is about something you can do when you've made small changes and you still want to evaluate. So in the UK, what we often do, we often count pedestrians and cyclists. So we'll put in a piece of infrastructure and count people walking and cycling before and after. But the problem, but it's a problem. It doesn't tell us. The things that we really need to know. So I developed this method as a sort of low-cost way of adding to data on how many people were walking and cycling. Because the problem is, if you count people walking and cycling, you can say, OK, we had 100 people walking before, we've got 150 people walking after. But are those 50 extra people really new? You don't know if they're new people walking. They could be people who previously walked a different way, who've changed the way they walk. They could be cyclists who used to go a different route, who cycle along this piece of new infrastructure. So what we really want to know often is how many trips are really new trips. How many people wouldn't have made that trip, but after the infrastructure went in, they now make that trip. And it's particularly important for estimating health benefits. Quite often, authorities want to calculate the health benefits from putting in new infrastructure, from making changes to the streetscape. But that means that you need to know the amount of additional walking or cycling. So just saying 100 walkers before, 150 walkers after, isn't very good, because those 50 extra might have just changed their route. They might not really be new walkers. And ideally, as it was touched on before, we'd like new walking and cycling to come from car travel. It doesn't always, but we would like it to. So the method I used here is low cost. It's not as good as a longitudinal survey, but you don't always want to do the best method. If you've spent 10,000 euros on something, you're not going to spend 100,000 euros evaluating it. That's just not realistic. But you can still do something. So what I did in this very small-scale study, so we had a street that had basically been closed to through motor traffic. They put some planters in the street, so you couldn't drive through it anymore. And when they counted pedestrians and cyclists, there were more pedestrians and cyclists afterwards. So this was positive, but we wanted to find out how many pedestrians and cyclists were really new. How many were people who didn't walk or cycle that trip before? So this is a method to estimate that. It's cheap, but I think it's still worth doing. So basically, we stopped people who were walking or cycling, and we asked them, would you have made this trip if this street was still open to motor traffic? And we then could look at what proportion of people said they were new pedestrians or new cyclists. And then we could factor up the counts. And we could say, OK, if we counted an extra 50 pedestrians, how many of them were likely to have been really new? And then when you've done that, you've got an estimate of the number of new people walking and cycling. You can then use the World Health Organization's economic assessment of walking and cycling tool. Or we have another tool called WebTag as well that we use in the UK. And you can estimate the health economic benefit. If you're surveying people, you can also ask them, do they like the changes? And not surprisingly, we found yes. People really like not having cars in their street all the time. That is very popular. So this is the street, by the way. It's a very attractive street. They basically just put that in the way. So they've put a road closed sign, so you can't drive all the way down the street. It used to be a cut through for people in cars, and it used to see 4,000 cars a day. Can you imagine in a street that wide, 4,000 cars a day? But that reduced to a few hundred. And we found that around a third of the extra people counted walking and cycling were really new. So only about a third of the apparent increase was really new. But still, this made a big difference. We found around 140 new walking or cycling trips every day, which doesn't sound very much. But when you use health economic tools over a 20-year period, you get a benefit of around £500,000. So actually doing that led to a health economic benefit of around £500,000. That cost about £10,000 to put in. So this method, it just involved doing some surveys of people, asking them about their behaviour change, asking them about what they thought about this. And we were able to estimate the number of new walkers and cyclists. It's not as good as a natural experiment, but it's still worth doing, I think, for small changes. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.